The chandeliers at the Ashworth Country Club sparkled above a sea of champagne glasses and pearls. But I might as well have been invisible. Table 12, tucked near the service doors, was where they placed me, the mother of the groom. The clatter of servers carrying trays nearly drowned out the music. It was a deliberate choice, I thought, though Adrian would later claim it was a mistake. My son had made sure I would not be the centerpiece of his grand evening. Adrian stood at the head table, tall in his tailored tuxedo, his bride Vivienne glowing beside him in a gown that looked like it belonged in a museum. The Morrows, her family, flanked them on either side, a parade of designer fabric and diamond watches. My hands rested on the folded napkin in my lap, steady even as my chest fluttered. I had raised this boy. I had carried him through winters when we had nothing but lentil soup and a rattling furnace. Yet tonight, I was scenery, a shadow at the farthest edge of his new life. He tapped his crystal glass with the knife, and the crowd hushed. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice polished with years of courtrooms and client dinners. Thank you for celebrating the most important day of my life. I stand here today, not only as a man in love, but as a man who has finally found a family that represents success, refinement, and true dignity. Applause rippled through the hall. My fingers tightened against the napkin. I waited for some mention of his father, of me, of the life that had shaped him. Instead, Adrian's gaze slid across the room and landed briefly on me. A smile, not warm but sharp, curved his mouth. I grew up in circumstances that were modest, he said, pausing to let the words sting. My father passed early, and my mother did her best with the little she had. She worked hard, but mediocrity was all she ever knew. I learned from her what I didn't want to become. Laughter bubbled from one corner of the room, uncomfortable and too loud. Someone coughed into a napkin. My cheeks flushed hot, but my face did not change. 67 years of discipline as a teacher, and then a principal, had taught me how to keep expressionless when children misbehaved. But this wasn't a child misbehaving. This was my son, my only son, disowning me in front of 180 guests. Adrian lifted his glass toward the Morrows. And then I met Vivienne, and I was welcomed by Whitman and Lorraine Morrow. They showed me what true success looks like. They became the family I never had. To them, I raise my glass with gratitude for giving me the role models I longed for. The clinking of glasses rang like hammer strikes against my ribs. My throat ached, but I sipped water, calmly, placing the glass down carefully so it wouldn't tremble. I would not give them the spectacle of an old widow breaking down. At the far side of the hall, I noticed movement. Dr. Silas Marin, a gray-haired man in a simple navy suit, pushed back his chair. He had worked with my late husband Alaric decades ago, one of the few who knew the truth of our life. His eyes flashed with indignation as he straightened clearly, about to object to set the record straight before the entire room. For a heartbeat, hope pricked at me someone else would defend my dignity so I wouldn't have to. But I raised my hand ever so slightly, palm downward, and caught his eye. Slowly, deliberately, I shook my head. His mouth closed. His shoulders sagged and he eased back into his chair. The music swelled again as Adrian concluded, basking in applause. I smoothed the napkin on my lap and breathed deeply, steadying myself. My silence was not weakness. It was choice. Because Adrian had no idea what I carried with me that night, or how easily I could turn his triumph into ashes. And that choice was the only thing keeping me still at table 12, waiting for what would come next. The night after the wedding, I returned to my small condo in Stamford, the one-bedroom unit above a laundromat, where the machines hummed into the early morning hours. I hung up the navy dress that had seen me through graduation's funerals, and now my son's wedding, and I slipped into silence as naturally as one slips into old slippers. Silence has been my companion for years. It asks for nothing and answers to no one. My life looks modest, almost invisible from the outside. A faded Toyota Corolla parked behind the building. A narrow kitchen with one good pan and a chipped teapot. 3 shelves of books, most borrowed from the library where I volunteer twice a week. I help children pick out storybooks and guide retirees toward the biographies they never had time to read before. The librarians know me as Ms. Veyrac, the dependable widow who alphabetizes returns with care. No one there would imagine I had once shared conference dinners at biotech summits or walked through the glass halls of research labs beside my husband. Alaric was the brilliant one. Dr. Alaric Veyrac, biomedical engineer dreamer with ink-stained fingers and notebooks filled with equations that looked like foreign alphabets to me. He believed in progress the way some believe in prayer. When he died, cancer having eaten away his brilliant body faster than any trial drug could slow it, he left me with a simple instruction written on the last page of his journal: protect Adrian from himself. Protect the legacy. At first, I did not understand. What legacy? The patents, the shares, the investments. Those were numbers on papers, and I was no scientist. But Alaric had looked at me with a clarity that burned through morphine haze. He will chase wealth without knowing its weight, he whispered in our last lucid conversation. Promise me you'll guard him from that hunger. I promised. Adrian had been 10 when his father's illness began to show. He was still the boy who built forts out of couch cushions, who brought me wildflowers clutched in sweaty palms, who sat beside his father at the desk asking questions about microscopes and formulas. He cried openly when Alaric first went into the hospital, clinging to my skirt as though I could shield all 3 of us. But grief changes children. By the time he was 15, after we buried Alaric in the family plot, Adrian had hardened. He stopped bringing me flowers. He started talking about getting out and making it big. At first, I mistook it for ambition, the kind of fire a father would have been proud of. But it grew sharp-cutting. He looked down on the hand-me-down coats, the patched-up car, the home-cooked meals. He wanted Armani suits, sleek cars, glittering city lights. He wanted everything his father and I had tried to teach him to measure carefully. I could not bring myself to tell him about the fortune that existed in quiet accounts, the fruits of Alaric's brilliance. To Adrian, I was just the widow principal who made do on a pension. And maybe I let him believe it, thinking that struggle might temper him, that modest living might shape the character his father had prayed for. Years passed. He grew into a man who spoke eloquently, who dressed impeccably, but whose eyes always searched for the higher rung, the wealthier circle, the shinier table. I stayed in the shadows, folding his old shirts into donation boxes, keeping his father's journals in a drawer. Only I opened, guarding a promise that felt heavier with each passing year. The legacy Alaric had spoken of still sat untouched, growing in silence, waiting for a moment neither of us had dared to imagine. And now, after the humiliation at the wedding, I knew that moment had arrived. After Alaric's funeral, grief pressed against me like a second skin, but I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Bills still arrived. Papers still demanded signatures. His colleagues delivered condolences in hushed tones, but alongside the flowers came envelopes, legal documents that would shape the next decades of my life. I remember sitting at our dining table now, too large for just me, surrounded by stacks of Alaric's files. His handwriting filled the margins, numbers circled, phrases underlined. My heart broke reading them, but I forced myself to focus. Because hidden among the grief was something extraordinary: ownership of patents, licensing agreements, and unclaimed royalties that could keep me afloat far longer than any pension ever could. At first, I thought of them only as remnants of his brilliance. But when his lawyer explained their value, I realized Alaric had left more than a legacy of ideas. He had left a fortune. The initial valuation alone dwarfed my annual salary from decades of work in education. I stared at the numbers, stunned. My husband, who had always lived modestly with me, had ensured a security I had never imagined. It would have been easy to squander it to buy a bigger house or a new car. Instead, I did what Alaric had always done, plan with precision. I sought advice from a trusted financial advisor, a quiet man named Colin Firth, not related to the actor who operated out of a plane office in New Haven. He taught me how to diversify, to protect, to grow what I had inherited. He warned me, too, that sudden wealth often destroyed families. I carried his words like scripture. It wasn't only the patents. Not long after, a young teacher from my district introduced me to her brother, a software developer working on an educational platform for schools. He needed investors. I knew the risks, but something about his earnestness and the vision of children learning through interactive programs tugged at me. I invested a portion quietly, never mentioning it to anyone. That platform became the backbone of remote learning years later, and my modest stake grew into something monumental. Between Alaric's patents royalties and that single bold investment, my accounts swelled. When Colin presented the numbers to me a decade later, the total left me breathless, over $39 million. I had built nothing flashy, bought no estates yet. There it was, wealth most people couldn't even dream of. But with that realization came a heavier weight. Adrian was in law school, then sharp-witted and eager, but already displaying the hunger his father had feared. He boasted of internships, measured himself against classmates by the brands of their suits and the pedigree of their families. I sat through his stories, nodding, never letting slip what waited in my accounts, because tucked into Alaric's final journal entry was his instruction: reveal the truth only if Adrian dishonors us. Until then, let him believe he stands on his own. I clung to those words. They became both shield and chain. Shield because they gave me purpose in silence. Chain because each year that passed, Adrian drifted further from the boy who once brought me wildflowers. He valued appearances more than principles. Still, I told myself I was protecting him, letting him forge character in the crucible of limitation. Even when I paid his tuition through anonymous checks or rescued him from credit card debt, under the guise of clerical errors, I told myself I was only cushioning, not enabling. I told myself I was honoring Alaric's wish. But as I folded the journal back into its drawer, after reading that line for the 100th time, a sliver of doubt lodged in me. Was I truly protecting Adrian from himself? Or had I simply built a cage of lies that allowed his pride to grow unchecked? That question burned quietly in me, even as I dressed for his wedding, knowing what I carried in my bag could destroy everything he had just proclaimed to the world. Adrian never asked where the lifeline came from. Perhaps he didn't want to know. Or perhaps he preferred the illusion that his victories were entirely his own. I told myself it didn't matter that a mother's hand was meant to steady even if unseen. The first time was during his second year of law school. A letter arrived from the bursar's office, stamped delinquent tuition balance. Adrian called me in a panic, his voice clipped with anger. "They're threatening to lock me out of exams," he said. I heard shame beneath his bravado, but also something colder, an expectation. I assured him it would be handled. The next morning, I walked into my bank, withdrew a cashier's check, and mailed it under a pseudonym. A week later, he told me, smug with relief. Turns out it was a clerical error. I only nodded. Then came the credit cards. He had discovered the lure of dinners in Manhattan, tailored suits, and nights that blurred into mornings. By 27, he was carrying balances no entry-level attorney could manage. Again, I sent anonymous payments. Sometimes I funneled them through charities he had once interned for, so the checks bore names he trusted. Looks like my firm is finally recognizing my potential. He told me one Christmas, waving away the idea of struggle. I smiled and let the lie rest between us like an unspoken truce. When he wanted to move out of his cramped studio and into a glass-towered apartment with views of the Hudson, I covered the deposit. A plain envelope, no return address, appeared in his mailbox at just the right moment. He called me the next week triumphant. "You see, Mom, hard work pays off." I told him it did. Inside, something twisted. The hardest moment came when he launched his own startup, a boutique law tech firm designed to streamline contracts. He boasted about venture capital interest, dazzled friends with jargon. But when the bills mounted, investors retreated and bankruptcy loomed. It was me who wired funds through a shell account. He emerged with his reputation intact, calling the collapse a graceful exit, while moving seamlessly into another prestigious firm. Each time I convinced myself it was for his own good. If he stumbled too hard, he might never recover. Better to soften the fall, to let him believe resilience came from within, rather than from the mother quietly standing behind him. I told myself Alaric would understand that this was still protection, still legacy, but the years stacked upon one another. And with them, Adrian's pride grew. He never spoke of gratitude, only of destiny. At dinner once, he declared I was born to rise above mediocrity. Some people just don't have it in them. He meant people like me? I set down my fork and sipped water, swallowing the words I wanted to hurl at him. He had no idea who had carried him through every so-called triumph. The checks became my way of keeping the peace, a silent thread binding us together. Yet silence has a cost. I watched him look at me with faint embarrassment when introducing me to colleagues, watched him flinch at my modest car, my modest clothes. All the while, I knew he drove on tires I had paid for, slept under a roof I had secured, built a reputation on debts I had erased. For years, I convinced myself I was doing what any mother would. But as I sat in that wedding hall, his words slicing into me, I finally felt the weight of my choices. The truth I had hidden to protect him was no longer a gift. It had become poison, and now it was spreading. Adrian's ambition always had an audience, but it found a stage the day he met Vivienne Morrow. She was luminous in the way people with old family names often are, confident, practiced, certain that the world bent just slightly in her favor. Adrian fell hard. He told me about her over coffee one Sunday, his words tumbling quickly, like a man describing a rare treasure he'd finally secured. "The Morrows have been in Greenwich for generations, Mother. Real pedigree. You'll see." I did see, though, not as he imagined. The first dinner invitation came soon after. Their estate rose at the end of a long drive lined with elms, the kind of house that seemed borrowed from a magazine cover. White columns, manicured lawns, windows glowing like amber. I wore a simple navy dress and pearls Alaric had given me on our 10th anniversary. They looked dull against Vivienne's diamond studs. The Morrows greeted me with the practiced warmth of people accustomed to hosting, but not to welcoming. Lorraine, Vivienne's mother, kissed the air near my cheek, her perfume cloying her smile, careful. Whitman Morrow shook my hand as if it were a formality he had been trained to endure. Adrian beamed, oblivious to the stiffness around us. Dinner was served in a hall with ceilings higher than my entire condo. Crystal glasses clinked, silverware shone. Conversation danced around hedge funds, vineyard shares, summer homes in Nantucket. I stayed quiet, listening the way I had done for years, in faculty meetings where young teachers boasted about new methods. You learn much by listening. When the talk turned toward education, Lorraine asked in her honeyed voice, "Eleanor, dear, you were a teacher. Is that right?" "A principal," I corrected gently. Her eyebrows rose slightly, then smoothed into neutrality. "How noble. And now retired, I suppose." Yes. Well? She said, turning back to her wine, it must be gratifying to see Adrian rise so high from such humble beginnings. I smiled, though inside something tightened. They did not see me. They saw only the shadow of Adrian's supposed climb. It was at the second dinner, weeks later, that I noticed the first crack. Adrian excused himself to tour the estate's library with Vivian. Left at the table with Lorraine and Whitman, I sipped my tea and glanced at the mantel. The photographs were all carefully staged black-tie galas, polo matches, European vacations, yet none looked recent. The frames gleamed, but the edges of the prints were sun-faded. Then Whitman excused himself to take a phone call. He didn't leave the room fully. Instead, he stepped into the hall, his voice low, but not low enough. Yes, I know the payment's late. I'll have it by the end of the month. Just extend the line another 30 days. Lorraine's fork froze midair. When she noticed me watching, she quickly launched into a story about Vivian's childhood piano recitals, her words brittle with effort. Later, as I walked back to my car along the stone drive, I glanced at the gatehouse and noticed the realtor's placard, half hidden in the hedge. A name, a phone number, a hint of something not meant to be seen. The estate was not theirs to own, it was leased, and by the look of things, precariously so. Adrian never saw it. He was too enchanted by Vivian's laughter, by the way she leaned into him as though she'd already crowned him part of their lineage. But I saw the gloss, the cracks beneath, and the desperation tucked into phone calls and faded photographs. That night, I drove my Corolla back to Stamford, the engine humming steadily, my heart heavy with the knowledge that my son was walking blind into a family more fragile than they appeared. In the quiet of my apartment, far from the polished halls of the Morrows estate, I opened the drawer that I had not touched in years. Inside lay Alaric's journal. The leather worn soft at the edges. The ink of his notes faded in places where my fingers had lingered too often. Beneath it rested a cream envelope still sealed, addressed in his precise handwriting. For Adrian's wedding day. I had seen it countless times, carried it from one home to another, dusted it on Sunday mornings, but I had never broken the seal. Now, with the taste of humiliation still sharp in my mouth after those dinners, and with the memory of Adrian's smug smile when Vivienne slipped her hand into his, I knew I could no longer ignore it. My hands shook as I slid a letter opener beneath the flap. The paper inside crackled, releasing a faint scent of cedar and ink. Alaric's voice filled my head as I read every word drawn with his usual clarity, as though he had anticipated the very moment I would sit here alone, searching for guidance. Eleanor. The letter began. If you are reading this, our son is about to take a step that binds him to another family. Marriage can bring out the best or the worst in a man. It will reveal his loyalties, his values, his true nature. You must be prepared for that test. I pressed the letter flat against the table, my throat tightening. Adrian is brilliant, but brilliance without humility becomes arrogance. I have seen the spark of it in him already, the disdain for simplicity, the hunger for applause. If he honors you, if he carries himself with respect for his mother, then keep silent and let him believe his rise is his own. But if he betrays you for status, if he ever dishonors you or my memory to climb higher in the eyes of strangers, then you must reveal the truth. Show him what you carry. Let him face who he has become. My eyes blurred. The words felt heavier than the paper that bore them. The letter ended with a single instruction. In this envelope you will find a USB drive. It contains recordings I made during his teenage years, when his arrogance began to show. I did not have the heart to confront him then, but one day he may need to hear his father's voice, telling him the truth he would not accept from anyone else. Use it wisely. It is the last gift I can give both of you." I lifted the folded page, and beneath it was the small silver stick no larger than my thumb. I held it as though it were alive. Alaric had been meticulous. He must have sat in his study weak from treatments, gathering his thoughts into a machine, because he feared his words would not last in memory alone. I plugged it into the old laptop on my desk. The folder contained 3 audio files, each named with dates scrawled in Alaric's careful manner. I clicked on the first. His voice, steady but tired, filled the room. Adrian sneered today when Eleanor suggested wearing his older jacket another year. He called it pathetic, said his classmates laughed at him for looking poor. He is 15. He does not see the value of restraint, the grace of modesty. I worry what he will become if this hunger hardens. The second recording echoed the same theme years later. The third, made only months before Alaric's death, cut deepest. Adrian told a friend that once I was gone, he would find a family that reflected real success. He forgets who built the foundation beneath his feet, Eleanor. If he repeats this cruelty to you when I am gone, remember this evidence. I closed the laptop, tears wetting my hands. The voice of my husband, preserved in a cold machine, had just handed me a weapon I never wished to use. Yet even as I pushed the drawer closed, I knew the time for hiding was drawing near. Because Adrian was already repeating the words Alaric had feared. The Ashworth Country Club glittered like a cathedral built for money. The chandeliers poured light over tables dressed in silk, and a string quartet played near the marble staircase, as if hired to underscore perfection. The booking alone must have cost $85,000, not including the orchids that draped every centerpiece and the champagne I overheard a guest praising $200 a bottle. Everywhere I turned, there was another sign of extravagance meant to impress. And yet I felt the weight of my own dress more than all their finery combined. Navy blue simple lines purchased from Macy's 2 years earlier for $200. It had carried me through church services and retirement dinners, and tonight it was asked to stand against gowns from Vera Wang and Dior. As I entered the hall, I heard the whispers. Not cruel enough to be shouted, but sharp enough to pierce. That must be Adrian's mother. The broke one. I took my seat at table 12 with the composure I had honed over decades in classrooms. Whispering students never broke me then, and they would not break me now. Still, my hands found the fabric of the dress, smoothing it flat, as if by taming the wrinkles I could quiet their judgment. Cocktail hour stretched like a test of endurance. Servers floated by with trays of foie gras and lobster crostini. I declined each one, taking only water, while Adrian's colleagues' lawyers, with slicked back hair and cufflinks that glinted, circled near the bar. Their laughter was the kind that carried, meant to be overheard. Can you imagine, one said, building a life with those Morrows when your own mother shows up in something off the rack? Adrian deserves credit, another replied. He's pulled himself up from, what was it? A principal's pension. Amazing he didn't inherit the broke gene. They chuckled. I sipped my water and said nothing. My silence, once again, was my armor. As I set my glass down, I caught sight of the Morrows across the room gathered in a tight cluster near the library doors. Lorraine's pearls caught the light, and Whitman's voice was hushed, yet urgency carried it across the carpet. I drifted closer, feigning interest in a display of family photographs. The line is stretched thin, Whitman won. Relative whispered. The banks won't extend it forever. I know, Whitman snapped quietly. But Adrian has connections now. His firm, his future, he'll keep us afloat. This marriage must hold. My breath caught. So this was the truth. The gleaming estate, the gloved hands, the cultivated air of superiority, it was all scaffolding propped against the weight of debt. Their confidence was an illusion, their fortune already bleeding away. And here was my son, so desperate to climb into their world, unaware that he was marrying into a crumbling house. I stepped back, my heart steadying with something that was not quite triumph and not quite sorrow. It was revelation. The Morrows were not saviors of status. They were supplicants dressed in finery, leaning on Adrian as though he were their last chance to maintain appearances. I returned to my table, the whispers of Adrian's friends still swirling the champagne, still flowing, the laughter still cutting. None of them knew the truth I now carried in two directions, that I was not broke and that the Morrows were not rich. As the string quartet shifted into a new piece and the staff began to usher guests toward their seats for dinner, I folded my hands in my lap and looked toward the head table. Adrian was smiling, radiant with pride, certain he had secured his place in the hierarchy he worshipped. But I knew better. I had Alaric's letter. I had my own fortune, and now I had overheard enough to understand the frailty of the Morrows' empire. The illusion was unraveling, and Adrian was too blind to see it. Dinner had been cleared, the champagne refilled, and the air thickened with anticipation. I knew what was coming. The clink of Adrian's knife against crystal rang sharp, silencing the hall. He stood tall, his tuxedo gleaming under the lights, his bride's hand resting on his arm like an ornament. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice commanding, "thank you for being here to celebrate this union. Tonight, I feel like the luckiest man alive." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. He smiled, waiting for quiet again, savoring the spotlight. "I want to speak not only of love, but of family," he continued. "For family shapes who we are, for better or worse." His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on me at table 12, before moving to the Morrows at the head table. "I was raised by a woman who tried," he said, his tone softened by feigned generosity. "She did her best, but mediocrity was all she knew. She could not give me what I needed to rise higher. But tonight, I gain a real Father Whitman Morrow who embodies success, refinement, and the dignity I've always strived toward." The words struck like a blade. My breath caught, but my face did not change. Half the room broke into applause, some clapping with enthusiasm, others hesitating, glancing at me with discomfort. At the head table, Whitman smiled like a man receiving a crown, raising his glass in acknowledgement. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap. I would not move, not yet. Adrian raised his glass toward his new in-laws. "To the Morrows, my true family. To Vivian, who has shown me what class and ambition can achieve. And to those who taught me what I did not want to become. I thank you as well." A few scattered laughs followed. My water glass trembled faintly in my hand, but I steadied it on the table. Inside me, rage tangled with sorrow. The boy I had raised, the boy who once cried at his father's hospital bed, was gone. In his place stood a man who traded respect for applause, who wielded cruelty as casually as a toast. And in that moment, Alaric's words returned to me as clearly as if he were seated beside me. "If he ever dishonors you with my memory, you have my permission." Permission, a word both freeing and heavy. For 8 years I had kept the silence Alaric asked of me. I had let Adrian believe in the illusion of struggle, let him claim victories that were padded by my invisible hand. I had swallowed every slight endured, every cold glance, hoping he might one day grow into the man his father dreamed he could be. But here he was, publicly erasing me, rewriting his story, so that Whitman Morrow, an indebted man in borrowed grandeur, stood as the father figure he claimed to deserve. The same Whitman whose estate I knew was held together by leases and phone calls for extensions. The room erupted in applause again, the sound crashing against me like waves. I did not clap. I sat motionless, the words of my husband burning through me. My silence, once a gift, was becoming a betrayal of myself. Adrian basked in the approval, lifting Vivian's hand to his lips. He looked proud, triumphant, blind to the truth crouching at the edges of the evening. I reached into my clutch, feeling the folded letter, the weight of the USB, the evidence of the life I had guarded in shadows. My husband's voice echoed again in my memory. Steady and certain, show him what you carry. Let him face who he has become. And I knew that the time for silence was nearly at an end. My clutch rested on the table beside my untouched dessert, its weight small to anyone else, but immense to me. I had carried it carefully all evening, as though it contained more than satin lining and a lipstick. In truth, it was a drawer of my life, compressed into a single evening's disguise. Inside lay the proof of all I had guarded for years. The Chase Bank screenshot neatly folded on heavy paper, showing my balance $39,100,000 and some $1,000. It had taken me hours to decide whether to print it. Screens can be dismissed as tricks. Paper leaves no doubt. Beside it was the deed. Crisp notarized with my signature, dated years ago when the Morrows estate was pulled into foreclosure. I had bought it at auction for a fraction of its worth, not to humiliate them, but to protect their children from scandal. I leased it back for $1 a year quietly, carrying the burden they pretended was still theirs. They never thanked me. They never even acknowledged me. Tonight, they sat at the head table in tailored splendor, unaware that their roof was held up by the woman in the navy dress they mocked. There was more. Photocopies of the anonymous checks, tuition paid in full, credit card debts, erased deposits for apartments and cars. Each one in my handwriting, though, signed with aliases. Together they formed a ledger of sacrifice, the invisible scaffolding of Adrian's life, which he believed stood by his own labor. And finally, Alaric's gifts. His letter, its words already etched into my memory, and the USB drive cool and silent, containing the echoes of his voice. I had listened once and could not forget the disappointment, the foresight, the warning. He had known even then that our son might grow into this man who could stand in a gilded hall and disown his mother without shame. I touched each piece in turn, my fingers brushing the edges as if gathering strength from them. For years I had told myself, silence was noble, that letting Adrian walk his path, even if it twisted, was better than binding him with truths he would not accept. But tonight, his cruelty had torn through that restraint. He had not just dishonored me. He had dishonored Alaric's memory, replacing his father with a man whose empire rested on borrowed time. The hall was still alive with music and laughter. Guests mingled, glasses clinked, and Adrian danced with Vivian under the light of chandeliers, his smile polished and bright. I sat at the edge, my pulse steadying into something cold and determined. I thought of Alaric's last days, how his hand had gripped mine with fading strength. "You will know," when he had whispered. For 8 years I doubted. Tonight there was no doubt. This was the moment he had prepared me for, the moment when silence was no longer patience, but complicity. The clutch closed with a soft snap, but inside me something opened. I was no longer the widow tucked at the corner table, the figure of pity and whispers. I was a custodian of truth, carrying the weight of a husband's foresight, a mother's sacrifices, and a fortune that could shatter illusions with a single revelation. I breathed deeply, the hum of conversation around me fading to a distant murmur. My fingers tightened on the clutch, the way they once tightened around Adrian's hand when he was small and frightened of thunder. Then I had held him to protect him. Now I would hold nothing back. Tonight I would open the drawer before everyone and let the world see what had been hidden in plain sight. And with that resolve, I rose from my chair, the clutch in hand, ready to step toward the microphone. The DJ's voice carried over the speakers, cheerful and oblivious. And now, a word from the mother of the groom. It was meant to be a gesture, a polite invitation easily declined. Adrian seized the moment with the arrogance of certainty. He leaned into the microphone, his smile wide. "She won't," he said, laughter dripping in his tone. "My mother hates the spotlight." Laughter trickled through the hall. A few chuckles, a few nods. They believed him. Of course, they had always believed him. To them, I was the invisible mother, the quiet widow, the one tucked away at the back table. I pushed my chair back and stood. The scrape of wood against tile echoed louder than the music had moments earlier. The laughter stuttered and fell into silence. I lifted my clutch, holding it close to my side, and began to walk. Each step felt deliberate, heavier than the last, until the murmur of surprise grew into gasps. 180 guests turned their eyes toward me. Adrian's smile faltered. I reached the podium. My hands did not tremble as I adjusted the microphone. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. I looked at my son, then at his bride, then at the Morrows, their polished masks already cracking at the edges. "Good evening," I said, my voice calm, steady. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight, to celebrate love, commitment, and the union of two families. It is a beautiful occasion." There was polite applause. The Morrows forced smiles. Adrian shifted uneasily, perhaps realizing I was not going to sit back down. I let the clapping fade, but I continued, and the single word seemed to slice the room in half. There are truths that cannot remain silent. The air thickened. A waiter froze mid-step, balancing a tray of champagne flutes. I glanced toward the back of the hall and saw Dr. Marin watching, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He gave the faintest nod, as though confirming what I already knew. I had reached the moment Alaric had prepared me for. My husband, Alaric, I said, was a man of brilliance and integrity. He believed character mattered more than wealth, respect more than applause. When he passed, he left me with guidance for the future, guidance for our son. I looked at Adrian. His jaw was tight, his hands fisted at his sides. He told me to remain silent unless the day came when Adrian dishonored us, when respect was replaced by ambition. Tonight, that day has come. Gasps rippled through the hall. Adrian shook his head quickly, smiling a brittle smile. "Mother, please, let's not." But I raised a hand, and the room quieted again. "I have carried many things in silence," I said. I carried the weight of sacrifice. I carried the fortune my husband left behind. I carried the truth of who has been lifting Adrian all these years. I touched the clutch, and I carried his words preserved in a letter, and his voice preserved on a recording. He foresaw this moment, though I prayed it would never come. A murmur swept across the tables. Questions, surprise, disbelief. Lorraine Morrow pressed her pearls as though they could protect her. Whitman's face drained of color. I straightened, every inch of me filled with the strength of the man I had loved and the promises I had kept. My silence ends tonight. The room was so quiet, I could hear the fizz of champagne in the nearest glass. And as I reached into my clutch, ready to begin unveiling the first truth, every eye in that glittering hall stayed fixed upon me. The hall was hushed, every glass poised midair, every breath held. I placed the USB drive gently on the podium, as though setting down something sacred, and connected it to the small speaker the DJ had reluctantly offered. My fingers hovered a moment, then pressed play. Static cracked. Then his voice came. Eleanor Alaric began, warm and steady even through the years. "If you're hearing this, then I'm no longer there beside you. But my words must be." A shiver passed through me. The sound of him was both balm and blade, healing and wounding at once. "Adrian." His voice shifted firmer now. "I speak to you as your father. Though I fear you may not like what you hear. You are intelligent, gifted, but I have seen a flaw growing in you: arrogance. You despise modesty, laugh at restraint, dismiss those who live simply. That path will not lead to greatness. It will lead to emptiness. Gasps swept across the room like a current. Heads turned toward Adrian, whose face had paled beneath the bright lights. Alaric's voice softened. Eleanor has carried more than you will ever know. She has been your protector, your anchor, and your mirror. She has given quietly without recognition, while you reached higher and higher, forgetting who steadied the ladder. Respect her. Honor her. Without respect, wealth is ash in your mouth. Vivienne's eyes widened. She looked from Adrian to me, then back again, confusion flickering in her expression. She had married a man who spoke of class and pedigree, and now she was hearing his father unmask him before strangers. Alaric's voice grew fainter, as though he were already fading from that faraway place. If you are listening now, Adrian, it means the moment has come that I feared. Do not dismiss your mother. Do not betray her. If you do, the truth will rise, and it will not be gentle. The recording clicked off, leaving only silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chairs shifted, whispers erupted, and the sound of shock filled the room louder than applause ever had. Adrian's lips parted, his voice caught in his throat. He glanced at Vivienne, seeking rescue, but her expression was cold, her hand slipping from his arm. I stood steady at the podium, the echo of Alaric's words still vibrating through me. My husband had spoken across time, and every guest had heard him. Adrian's mouth finally found words strained and brittle. This is manipulation, my father's voice. But even as he spoke, I reached for the next piece in my clutch, ready to show them that his father's voice was only the beginning. Adrian's protests cracked in the air, brittle and frantic. This is manipulation. My father's voice was twisted, staged. I let him flail for a moment, then opened my clutch once more. The paper was folded with precision, as though the neatness itself carried authority. I held it up, unfolded it slowly, and placed it beneath the microphone so that the overhead light caught the bold numbers at the top. This, I said evenly, is the current balance of my checking account at Chase Bank. $39,082,614. Gasps burst across the room, sharper than the champagne bubbles fizzing in half-forgotten glasses. Some leaned forward to see others craned their necks. The whispers rose, a wave breaking against the fragile dignity of the Morrows. Lorraine's hand flew to her pearls, her knuckles white. Whitman's eyes darted like a man trapped. Adrian's face flushed deep red. He laughed, but it was the wrong kind of laugh, jagged too loud. Forgery? He snapped, pointing toward the paper. It's fabricated. She's making a spectacle. None of it's real. I met his fury with quiet. Anyone here who doubts me, I said, turning to the crowd, is welcome to pull out their phone log into Chase and scan the verification code printed on the corner. It will confirm the account and today's balance. I invite you to prove me false. A young man at the second table, some finance friend of Vivienne's, had already lifted his phone. His brows arched as he scanned, and then he turned slowly toward the head table. It's valid, he whispered. But the whisper carried. A second phone rose, then a third. Each confirmation passed like a spark catching fire. The room's energy shifted, laughter gone doubt, giving way to shock. I straightened, letting them absorb what this meant. For years I continued. I let my son and the world think I lived on scraps, that I was the widow in a modest condo, counting pennies. That illusion served a purpose. But tonight, when my own child stands here and calls me broken, mediocre, unworthy, it becomes necessary to show otherwise. The hall had gone so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Adrian sputtered. This doesn't make sense. If you had that money, you wouldn't be. He gestured toward me at my simple dress, at the life he thought he understood. You wouldn't live the way you do. I tilted my head. And that, Adrian, is precisely why you cannot understand your father. Or me. Wealth is not worth when it costs you respect. A murmur of agreement rippled through the guests, subtle but growing. Eyes turned on Adrian now, not me. His story was unraveling. I folded the paper and returned it to my clutch. My hands did not tremble. I had spent 8 years carrying silence. Now truth steadied me more than silence ever had, and I was only at the beginning. The air in the hall was brittle, stretched tight after the revelation of my fortune. I could feel every gaze fixed on me, as though the quiet woman from table 12 had suddenly become the axis of the evening. Adrian tried to rally, but the room was no longer on his side. He sputtered, stammered his hands, chopping the air in frantic denial. I let him spin in circles before I reached again into my clutch. The paper I drew out was heavier, embossed with seals that spoke louder than any words could. I laid it flat on the podium, smoothing the edges with deliberate care. This, I said, and my voice carried with new strength, is the deed to the Morrow estate. A ripple tore through the guests. Some craned their necks, others rose halfway from their chairs. I paused, letting the silence swell before continuing. I purchased this property in 2010 at a foreclosure auction. At the time, the Morrows faced collapse. To shield their children from scandal, I offered them a lease arrangement, $1 a year renewable. I have carried the estate quietly ever since. The words struck harder than the bank statement. Lorraine gasped, clutching her pearls so tightly it seemed they might snap. Whitman's face drained of blood. He swayed once, then gripped the table for balance before collapsing back into his chair. The applause that had once crowned him had turned to horrified murmurs. Guests whispered sharply to one another, disbelief mingling with recognition. They had all seen the cracks before faded photographs, cautious extravagance, but none had dared question it. Now the truth lay naked before them. The Morrows, I continued, were never what they appeared. Their estate, their status, their inheritance, all propped on an illusion I allowed to stand. Out of mercy. Out of silence. Tonight, that silence ends. Whitman lowered his face into his hands. Lorraine's eyes darted wildly, searching for escape. Vivian sat frozen, her complexion ghostly. Her diamond earrings suddenly looking more like trinkets than treasures. Adrian's voice broke the stunned quiet. "No," he barked. "No, this is a lie. They're respected, established. I held the deed aloft. The town clerk's records will confirm every word. My name has been on this property for 14 years. Ask any lawyer in this room to verify. The Morrows have been my tenants, not my equals." Gasps scattered across the hall. A man in the back whispered too loudly, "Tenants. For $1." Laughter followed, thin and nervous at first, then growing as disbelief turned to shock. Adrian's face contorted, fury and panic colliding. He looked to the Morrows for support, but they had none left to give. Whitman sat slumped, staring into his wine glass as if it might erase the truth. Lorraine dabbed at her temples with a napkin. Vivienne's hand slid from Adrian's arm, her eyes refusing to meet his. I spoke again, quieter now, but sharper for it. "You sought prestige, Adrian, by tying yourself to this family. But prestige built on pretense will always crumble. The father you chose tonight is a man who has lived in my house for over a decade, at my mercy, under my roof." The murmur rose into a storm of voices, questions, disbelief, even mocking laughter. A few phones glowed as guests pulled up property records, eager to confirm what I had declared. Each new verification was another nail hammered into the illusion Adrian had worshipped. I gathered the deed, folded it carefully, and returned it to my clutch. My silence had carried them all for years, but tonight, the burden was no longer mine. Adrian stood, paralyzed, his mask shattered. And I had not yet finished revealing the truths he feared most. The room was already rattled voices buzzing with disbelief when I reached again into the clutch. The final stack of papers was thinner, but their weight was heavier than gold. I unfolded the ledger I had compiled over the years, a record of every check written, every transfer made, every anonymous cushion placed beneath my son's falls. I lifted my eyes to Adrian. You speak of standing on your own, of rising above mediocrity, but tonight you will learn how much of your ascent was built on the silence of the mother you dismissed. The whispers dimmed curiosity, drawing them closer. I began to read. Tuition at Columbia Law second year, paid in full by an unmarked cashier's check, $37,000. The bursar's office could confirm if they cared to trace it. I heard a few sharp intakes of breath. Adrian's fists tightened at his sides. Credit card balances settled repeatedly between 2014 and 2016. $43,100. Each time you told friends you had received a bonus at work. Gasps now louder than before. Your apartment on Riverside Drive. Initial deposit and first 6 months' rent. $22,000. The envelope came by mail, addressed from no one. The crowd shifted uneasily, some glancing toward Adrian, others toward me, as if measuring the distance between myth and truth. Your car, Adrian. The BMW you drove proudly to impress clients. Payments, insurance, repairs, $26,200. All covered. I turned the page. My voice was steady, though my heart thudded with each line. And then your failed startup, the grand venture you claimed as proof of genius. I cleared $112,000 in debts you could not pay. Without that, you would have declared bankruptcy before 30. Murmurs rippled, rising into shocked disbelief. In total, I said, holding up the sheet, $280,000. Every penny traced. Every penny placed quietly into your path so you could keep walking without stumbling. And yet you mocked me tonight as the woman who knew only mediocrity. I let the silence fall. The weight of it was heavier than applause, heavier than laughter. Adrian's face burned crimson, his jaw trembling, as though he could not decide between rage and shame. From the corner of the room, someone whispered, "He never stood alone." Another voice followed. Every success cushioned. The words spread like wildfire, repeating themselves at table after table until the truth echoed louder than his speech had. I looked directly at him. Every diploma you hung on your wall, every lease you signed, every toast you gave at firm dinners cushioned by my hand. And you never saw it, because I never wanted credit. I wanted character. Adrian's eyes darted wildly, searching for an anchor. Vivian had withdrawn her hand from his entirely. Lorraine Morrow's eyes shone with humiliation, not for me, but for herself. Whitman still sat, slumped, defeated. I placed the ledger back into my clutch, snapping it closed. My voice softened, but did not waver. Your pride has lived on borrowed foundations, Adrian. Tonight, those foundations are gone. The hall seemed to pulse with silence, everyone waiting, watching their faces lit by the ruin of a man who thought himself untouchable. And still, I had one revelation left, heavier than all the others combined. The hall was a hushed battlefield, the wreckage of illusions scattered in silence. Adrian stood rigid, his face tight with fury. But before he could speak, I drew the last document from my clutch. A single envelope sealed with the notary's mark, the edges sharp as a blade. This I said, placing it on the podium as my will. Executed this week, reviewed by attorneys, signed and witnessed according to law. A murmur swept through the guests, low, uneasy, the kind of sound people make when they sense the ground shifting beneath them. Adrian's head jerked, his eyes narrowing. I broke the seal and lifted the paper. My voice was steady, every syllable measured. My estate, valued at $39 million, has been reassigned. The Alaric Verac Foundation will receive the bulk to fund cancer research and scholarships for students who would otherwise never see a university. The words hung heavy, undeniable. Some guests nodded quietly. Others exchanged glances, startled at the scale. I continued. My son, Adrian Verac, will receive exactly $1. No more, no less. Gasps erupted, rippling across the room like a sudden storm. Someone's champagne glass toppled and shattered, unnoticed in the shock. Adrian went white, then red, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning without air. $1, I repeated, folding the will back into its envelope. Because wealth without respect is wasted. Because love was given freely, but respect was demanded and denied. Because tonight my silence ends, and so does indulgence. I turned to him fully now. No podium, no papers between us. Every sacrifice, every hidden payment, every quiet mercy was meant to build your character. Instead, it built your pride. And pride is the most fragile fortune of all. Adrian tried to laugh, but the sound cracked in his throat. You can't be serious. This is some cruel theater. You wouldn't— I did. I interrupted my tone, cutting clean through his protest. The foundation is already incorporated. The documents are filed. The transfer begins tomorrow morning. I could see it in his eyes. The scramble, the collapse, the desperate calculation of a man realizing the ladder he had climbed was leaning against air. From the back of the room, someone clapped once sharply. Then another joined and another, until the sound filled the hall, not jubilant, but reverent. Applause not for me, but for the justice that had been spoken aloud. Adrian's fists slammed against the table. You think this makes you noble? You've ruined me. I lifted my chin, my voice calm, final. No, Adrian, you ruined yourself. I simply refused to fund it any longer. The applause swelled, some guests rising to their feet, others whispering fiercely behind their hands. Vivienne turned her face away from him, her ring glittering coldly as she pulled her hand from his entirely. Lorraine hid behind her napkin, while Whitman stared at the floor. I looked out at the gathered faces, not for approval, but for clarity. Love may open doors, I said, letting each word fall like a stone in still water. But only respect keeps them open. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that holds judgment within it. I gathered the documents, slipping them back into my clutch. My hands were steady, my heart strangely light, and then, as the applause died away and Adrian's face twisted with desperation, I saw in his eyes what was coming next. Not the fight in public, but the plea in private. The night air was cool when I stepped outside, the chandeliers of the country club fading behind me. My heels clicked softly on the pavement as I walked toward my car, relief and weariness mingling in my chest. For the first time in years, I felt lighter, though I knew the evening was far from finished. I heard his voice before I saw him. Mother Adrian's tone was ragged, stripped of the polish he had flaunted all night. He emerged from the shadows near the valet stand. His tie loosened, his hair disheveled. He looked less like the triumphant groom and more like a boy who had lost something he never understood. He blocked my path before I reached the car. You can't do this. You can't cut me out in front of everyone. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To my marriage, to my future? I met his eyes. I know exactly what I've done. I've given you the truth. He shook his head violently. The truth. You humiliated me. You made me look like a fool in front of Vivienne, in front of the Morrows, in front of my colleagues. They'll never respect me now. I unlocked the car with a soft click. Respect isn't inherited, Adrian. It isn't bought. It is earned. You cannot sue respect into existence. He flinched, but his expression hardened. You think you've beaten me? I'll contest the will. I'll take you to court. Every lawyer in Connecticut will line up to represent me. I turned to him fully. The keys cool in my hand. Do you imagine I haven't prepared for that? The will was reviewed by attorneys far sharper than any you could hire. It is ironclad. You cannot frighten me with lawsuits. His face contorted fury bubbling. Then it cracked into something desperate. His voice fell into pleading. Please, Mother. I'm your son. Blood. You can't just erase me. I've worked my whole life, don't let it all slip away. I stared at him, the weight of Alaric's letter echoing in my mind. This was the child I once carried in my arms, the boy who cried when he scraped his knee, the young man who stood by his father's hospital bed. Somewhere along the way, he had twisted himself into believing status was love. But still, he was mine. Quietly, I said, I will give you one chance. His head snapped up, hope flaring. Anything. Name it. You will not inherit a cent as you are now. But if you join the Alaric Veyrac Foundation as a volunteer 5 years of service, no salary, no shortcuts, no titles, and if you show humility, if you prove that respect lives in you, then and only then will the board release funds to you. Until then, your inheritance remains $1. The hope in his eyes faltered, tangled with indignation. 5 years manual work. That's beneath me. Then you have your answer, I said simply. Remain as you are, and you keep nothing. Serve, and you may yet hold your father's name with dignity. His mouth opened, but no sound came. He stood there, torn between rage and possibility, the pride that had chained him for years, battling against the faint, flickering chance of redemption. I opened the car door and slipped inside the interior light, casting his face in stark relief. He looked young again, lost but also dangerous in his desperation. As I closed the door, I rolled down the window just enough to let my final words reach him. The choice is yours, Adrian. Pride or humility. One will starve you, the other may save you. I started the engine, the hum filling the silence. He stepped back, fists clenched, caught between two paths. And as I pulled away from the country club into the quiet Connecticut night, I knew the battle was no longer mine, it was his. The winter had passed and spring light warmed the windows of my small Stamford apartment. The world outside moved with its usual rhythm, neighbors hurrying to buses, children dragging book bags. Twice their size, the hum of life unchanged. Inside, I found my own rhythm quieter but steady. On the sill of my kitchen window, 6 glass jars lined neatly, each cradling a rose cutting I had coaxed to life. Their roots twisted in the water, delicate yet determined, reaching toward survival. I tended them each morning, changing the water, trimming the stems, watching the petals unfold in hues of blush and ivory. The newspapers still arrived with their noise. Headlines carried words I had once thought unimaginable: 39 $39 gift funds, cancer breakthroughs. Veyrac Foundation announces new scholarship program. Photographs of smiling researchers and young students filled the pages, their futures now tethered to Alaric's name. My husband's legacy was no longer just a memory. It was alive, pulsing through laboratories and lecture halls. That thought steadied me when silence grew too loud. Occasionally, letters arrived at my door. Families thanking the foundation for covering treatments they could not afford. Students writing in trembling handwriting about dreams of medicine or engineering now possible because of a scholarship they hadn't dared to hope for. I read each one, folded them carefully, and kept them in a box near my husband's journal. Their gratitude belonged to him as much as to me, and Adrian, his name, surfaced in rumors carried on the breeze of gossip. The Morrows had withdrawn quickly after that night, retreating into shadows they once ruled. Vivienne filed for divorce 3 months into the marriage, citing irreconcilable differences, though everyone knew what those words disguised. Adrian drifted from one firm to another, his brilliance undermined by whispers of arrogance, of disgrace, of the night his mother unmasked him. I heard he rented an apartment in the city smaller than the one he once boasted about, and that his ties to the Morrows had been severed cleanly. I thought of him often, though not with the rage that had burned in me at the wedding. No, my thoughts were more complicated threads of sorrow, faint flickers of hope, and an ache that no fortune could dull. He had not called, not written. Silence was his answer for now. Whether it would remain forever, only time would decide. Still, I did not regret what I had done. Alaric's letter had been clear. Respect could not be demanded in whispers. It had to be spoken into light. The night I chose to end my silence was the night I honored both my husband and myself. The roses leaned toward the window pane, their petals brushing the glass as though yearning for the air outside. I touched one gently, its softness fragile against my fingers. Flowers, like people, needed tending. Some thrived with care. Some withered no matter how much water you gave them. Yet still, I planted. As dusk fell, the apartment filled with a warm glow. I sat near the window, the scent of roses faint in the air, and whispered into the quiet. "Love may open doors," I said. My voice steady, my heart calm, but only respect keeps them open. The roses caught the last of the fading light, and for a moment it felt as if Alaric was there beside me, smiling at the life still unfolding. And so I remained in my little apartment in Stamford, not broke, not defeated, but whole.